if you explained to an alien how the economic incentives of planet Earth work, they would be able to predict for you all of the different catastrophes that we're experiencing on planet Earth. That has not changed. And because the social media companies are still subject to that exact system, because they're still working within the profit maximization context, because they're still ultimately beholden to a board of directors that's beholden to shareholders and indeed have a legally binding fiduciary duty to maximize profit, and all these problems that, again, naturally arise from the fact that the incentive is to keep people staring at their phones. At the smallest level, although this is itself a massive change, is bringing a whole new design paradigm to the way that we're designing technology, in which the focus is not on these very simple metrics that are not aligned with what people actually care about, but to really, it starts with a philosophical project to get really, really clear about what is meaningful, what is valuable, what is the actual service that we're trying to provide, what is the way in which we want people's lives to get better individually and collectively. Silicon Valley historically has very little in the way of tools to understand qualitative experience and the subtleties and nuance of phenomenology of our subjectivity.
Hi, welcome back to Innovative Minds. I'm your host, TaiwanPlus. I'm joined by Justin Rosenstein and Audrey Tang. We previously discussed the power of collaboration tools to democratize digital structures, as well as the dangers posed by social network addiction and polarization. Audrey, I would like to continue this conversation by asking for your thoughts on how we can improve openness and transparency in the realm of digital commons.
Yeah, when I was in my second startup working with Taiwan's National Academy, the main idea behind that was called Creative Commons. And the Creative Commons is a movement around the world where people want to change the incentives by the copyright system so that the people can share whatever they have created, and some with the condition that you can change it, but you have to keep sharing what you have changed. And one of the most prominent example of Creative Commons share-alike is Wikipedia, and there are many other projects, OpenStreetMap and so on, where people just treat this encyclopedia, this map, this like common knowledge base as a commons. And if you look at the governance structures that have grown out of those commons project, there is one big difference, right? Is where the funding came from. Instead of returning the people's attention in the forms of capture shareholder or advertiser profits, Wikipedia simply asks people to donate to Wikipedia. So I think there is something to be said about alternate funding models to the commons, whether it's through government grants or through donations and so on. There are also successful like entrepreneurship projects built by a foundation and not-for-profit, but owning a subsidiary for-profit company to make it a with-profit company. Of course, the Mozilla Foundation and the Mozilla Corporation that builds the Firefox browser and so on come to mind. These are early examples. But I think there are a new generation of entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, that look at these potentials enabled by alternate funding models and really create new movements based on new funding models to build their businesses from. So whether they're like the first-time startup just decided to build their startup as a not-for-profit, like Vivi Lin that we have interviewed on the first season of Innovative Minds and so on, or people on their second or third startup and they really want to try a different funding model. I think this kind of capped profit or with profit is becoming somewhat mainstream among the Taiwanese social entrepreneurs.
And this idea of commoning, of the people who are using and being affected by some system being the ones who govern it and are in control of it, is, I think, such a critical concept and so pivotal to us moving as a society in a direction away from the incredibly inequitable, racist, sexist, problematic structures that we have today, in which you have this elite capitalist class that is in control of so much of the power and wealth in the world, to a world in which power and resources are equitably distributed. And commoning, there was essentially a smear campaign in the 20th century against commoning, and famous essay about the tragedy of the commons that had the idea of, oh, if you don't have the state, or if you don't have market forces and private ownership, you're inevitably going to get the destruction of these resources. And that's just not true. There was a intentional smear campaign that was perpetrated by the people who benefited from it. And Elinor Ostrom is a economist who won the Nobel Prize in economics, who really looked into the actual history of commoning, which is that for basically the entirety of human history, it has been the most common form of the way that we manage resources and power. And it is highly, highly effective, because you only get a tragedy of the commons in the case that you have a bunch of people who aren't coordinating with each other. When you have coordination, when you have people creating rules and norms and self-governing, then you're able to, whether it's a forest or a fishery or the air, you're able to effectively have democratic participatory control of these common resources. And historically, that's been done at small scale, because that kind of coordination was only possible at small scale. But as we live in a more globalized society where we have more common resources that, like the atmosphere as a whole, or internet commons that are not just at local scale, but at global scale, we fortunately now have the digital tools to also be able to coordinate and govern at global scale.
Indeed. Currently in Taiwan, we're working with, for example, the Universal Service Fund and so on. That's my ministry's mandate. And just in discussing with Spectrum Allocation and Universal Service Fund, the Director Generals of Resource Planning just recently quoted all the principles of Ostrom in the internal ministerial meeting with other Director Generals. And I think there really is a natural affinity between the Director Generals, the Korea Public Service, that has stewardship to this common resources digitally, like spectrum and numbers and addresses and so on, as well as the civil society organizations that also is piloting a much better way of turning the investments of energy and investment of attention into something that benefits the commons as a whole. So I always stress the importance of people first, PPP, or people public-private partnership, in that if the social sector, the social entrepreneurs, and the public sector, the Korea Public Service, can figure out new mechanisms to incentivize commons investments, then actually it creates a legitimacy for the private sector actors to act toward these new incentives. And that's partly why we have reshuffled our budget priorities for our, for example, digital transformation fund, the T-Cloud fund, to prioritize subsidizing any social entrepreneurs, including co-ops, people working on long-term healthcare, anyone who can prove that they're making investments into the local or global commons, and they get more subsidies, more business development opportunities, and so on first. So I think it also doubles as a very good public sector entrepreneurship incentivizing strategy, because the younger generations, they do put more energy into entrepreneurship if they can see that it is actually benefiting the commons, not just arbitrary shareholders.
That's really cool.
Justin, as an entrepreneur, how do you think the private and nonprofit sectors can realign their values with democratic principles and the common good?
I actually now work full-time on a social venture, a nonprofit called One Project. I'm still involved with Asana as a board member and advisor, but primarily work on One Project, whose purpose is precisely to be working with communities in order to develop new models of economics and democracy that are more participatory, more effective, more fair and equitable, more in harmony with ecological regeneration. And it's for precisely this purpose of the dominant economic and political models, we believe, are just fundamentally broken and are essentially the operating system. They're deep down there as a root cause from which you can then understand all of the social ills that we're experiencing as arising from this basic set of economic and political rules and incentives. And so the first step is to start by taking the existing experiments that are happening all over the world in sometimes experiments in new novel forms, in some cases just the continuation of pre-capitalist forms of much more participatory, fair systems of economics and governance, and bringing more power to them, helping them to become more resilient against the dominant system, and to become more scalable and use, in some cases, social power and people power, but in other cases, use digital technology to be able to take these more effective, equitable, ecological systems and enable them to be more and more of a meaningful competitor to the dominant, hegemonic capitalist market state system.
I see. What you're envisioning is a thorough overhaul of the political and economic structures involved. Now, do you think it's possible to transform the system through policy reforms?
I think policy plays a critical role, and in a way, a very necessary role in order to contain the collective action problem. So, collective action problems, or they're sometimes called multipolar traps, are situations in which if you don't have coordination between actors and each actor acts in its own self-interests, you get these effects that are bad for everyone. So nuclear proliferation is an example. I think every country would prefer that there were not any nuclear weapons, but because there's no airtight way to ensure that no country has nuclear weapons, it's in each country's not just interests, but they are almost required for national security to build that up. Or, at least in America, there's so much sugar in food, and I think that's a result of any food company that doesn't invest in that, their food is not competitive in the market. And I think you see the same thing in technology, where, and I see this excuse over and over again, or this reason where you'll have leaders at social media companies or AI companies that say, yeah, we wish that we could make this less addictive. We agree it would be safer if we were deploying AI at a slower rate. But if we don't do it, someone else will. And so in a lot of cases, those companies, the people behind the scenes actually are asking for regulation because that will enable them to do the right thing without worrying that an unscrupulous competitor won't then just take advantage of them being an ethical actor. So regulation is the tool that we so far today have to be able to bind those kinds of traps. In terms of what that should look like, I think, one, we should be using the existing regulatory model, as broken as it is. Within AI, for example, you're seeing the EU AI Act, or for applying to both AI and social media, there's in America, the Algorithmic Accountability Act. And I would love to see these pieces of legislation actually move to be passed and be able to help bind these problems. At the same time, there are things that are fundamentally broken about the existing governance models, that they are quasi-democratic. You have in America this two-party system. It's very hard to get things done. There's data that shows that what the United States government is likely to do is highly correlated with what the wealthiest people in America want, and has extremely little correlation with what the average person in America wants. So ideally, what we would do is use the existing state regulatory powers to create laws that enshrine a new, more participatory system into law, that where the people are more directly involved in defining the rules of these systems, which is to say, like many of the experiments that Audrey has done, or there's various forms of new systems or very old systems of democracy that are more effective, more collaborative, engage more people's voices than the kind of 51% vote system that we've come to think of as democracy. If we could develop those participatory governance systems and essentially have companies report not to a board of directors, but report to the people, report to these democratic participatory governance processes, and then have regulation require companies to, at a minimum, take into account the voice of those participatory democratic processes, that would be a step in the direction of us moving away from everything being about profit maximization and toward the people being in control of these systems that control their lives.
Yeah, I totally agree that a deliberative system institutionalized to get democratic input from the people to share the agenda setting power with the people is paramount. In Taiwan, for a few years now, many years now, people are used to the e-petition system where people can start this new ideas, get 5,000 signatures, like recently people petitioning for 4-day work week, and so on, and then just expect the journalists to take it, amplify it, and for the ministers to take it seriously, to respond to it in a point-by-point factual basis, and so on. So some sort of participatory system is already within our regulatory institutions. What I would like to add now is also for some way to, instead of waiting for the private sector to respond point by point to the synthesis documents of people's deliberations and petitions, what if the largest private sector companies also have a pipeline similar to the one we have built around the national participation system, so that, for example, when people surface a new harm, a new injustice enabled by AI companies, maybe the AI models can be actually retrained and fine-tuned to reflect that particular concern that people have surfaced somewhat automatically, right? In software development, we have this idea called continuous integration, meaning that when people finding a issue and experimenting with fixes and so on, people who sign up to the nightly versions, to the beta versions of those software get to experiment those fixes first, and then see whether it actually causes more harm or actually address the problem. And only when the beta testers or the nightly testers are okay with it, do they actually go into the product release. And by adopting continuous integration, the software quality, including with bug bounties, including with like working with white hat hackers and so on, improves the convenience and the security of the product. So what we're now working toward is what we call alignment assemblies, which is asking people what they see as wrong or harmful of the current generation of language models and other generative AI, and somehow figure out a way to take the matrix of democratic inputs and use that to retrain the AI so that it responds to people's collective will. So this is something that we're experimenting with, and we'll launch the first ones around August, September.
Audrey and I are both advisors to the Collective Intelligence Project that is using, at first Polis, but is looking at using these kinds of participatory democratic tools in order to get input from the people on what should be the direction of artificial intelligence. And OpenAI themselves recently started an experiment on democratic inputs to AI that I advised on, and I think is a good start, although there's a lot further for them to go. They're starting with having people participate in deciding basic things about the like political orientation or willingness of ChatGPT to say certain things or not say certain things. But ultimately, my hope is that is a stepping stone toward a much more radical democratic experiment of allowing the people to decide deployment schedules and when harms need to be considered and evaluated, and who should be the beneficiaries, how should there be compensation to people who who've provided input. There's a whole host of like deep fundamental questions about what is AI for? Where should these incredible supercomputers and superintelligence be applied? That if they remain in the hands of the sort of free-for-all, free market capitalist system, the very incentives that we already have will continue. And to the extent that we already see that companies use the intelligence and resources they have at their disposal to continue to hurt the environment, or to strip mine our consciousness in order to stare at ads, artificial intelligence makes that incredibly accelerated. But if we can make sure that democracy is at the heart of deciding, and participation and wisdom, a wise democratic process is at the heart of deciding what AI is used for, then AI could be this incredible benefit to humanity.
Thank you for your insights. I want to ask, though, how can we ensure that democracy is both participatory and well-informed when making decisions on complex topics such as AI?
Yeah, there's a general problem, and I think in many ways democracy over time has gotten a bad rap, because when you think of the ways we do democracy today, generally of 51% of a popular vote, of a citizenry that has not had time to think carefully about the issues or responding to charismatic candidates, then it feels like a populism that leads to very poor decisions. In order for democracy to be not just legitimate, but actually wise, you need systems that empower the participants to have the information that they need, to have the real and the time to think things through deeply. So citizen councils is a great example of a democratic system where you take a representative sample of the population and pay them and give them the time and space to come and meet together in person, for potentially months at a time, and learn from the experts, learn deeply about systems, the systems that they're going to be governing, deliberate, talk things through, and then come to decisions that are much wiser, more thoughtful, more mindful than if they were just voting when they didn't understand. Now, you're pointing out that in some cases, even the experts don't understand, but we can understand, at least the people making those decisions can at least understand the extent that the experts understand. And within AI, I think one of the most exciting things I've seen is Anthropic's model, Anthropic being one of the main competitors to OpenAI, of constitutional AI, where you essentially provide you provide a document to the LLM, to the AI system, that explains the values, that explains you should do this and not this, you should optimize for this, you should always be good in these ways and avoid being evil in these ways. And while it's not perfect, so what I've seen in the research so far is that it's quite effective in shaping the sort of behaviors and apparent attitudes of the systems. So who should be empowered to write that constitution? Ultimately, the people. Ultimately, the people who are going to be affected by these AI systems should be democratically defining the constitutions that then define the behavior of the AI systems.
So I remember when we met face-to-face in the Asana office, I bring with me this MacBook, this laptop with 96 gig RAM, and demonstrated that something approaching ChatGPT 3.5 can be run entirely locally with reasonable speed. And using exactly the sort of techniques Justin just mentioned, now it's approaching ChatGPT 4 level capabilities, but still running entirely locally. And the one thing that differentiates this local model with the earlier experiments is that I can just tell it, like this is 1,000 frequently asked questions to Audrey, and this is how Audrey have answered them because we have this transcript. And then I can tune this personal assistant to basically see the world from the worldview that I have expressed from my previous transcripts. And I've been able to do this training using new techniques like QLoRa over just 24 hours on a single computer without anybody else's GPUs. And I think this democratization of training and fine-tuning capabilities using constitutional principles specific to specific communities is the other requirement. So the one requirement Justin already mentioned is for OpenAI and Anthropic and so on to pre-commit to take democratic input into their meaningful decisions. But the other thing is that each and every individual, just like in the early personal computer days, with a spreadsheet that fits, like VisiCalc, very small memory, being able to experiment with new ways of fine-tuning such technology so that everybody understands the kind of uses and abuses and how to counter those abuses instead of arbitrarily leaving it to the top labs to say, okay, we will do the retraining, but only after 6 months, only after 12 months, or things like that. We should also be able to organize in a grassroots fashion to tune our community models as viable alternatives from all previous experience of addictive technologies. Only when everybody understands the actual harms, the specific harms, and have the ways to put words into those collective concerns, do the large companies actually pivot and respond to the people's concerns.
Which is exciting, though I'll say, and I'm curious what you think, but it also is very concerning to me, the democratization of LLMs and the fact that I knew that GPT 3.5 level was possible to run locally. Mm-hmm. This is news that you're getting close to GPT 4 level. Does it concern you that, even if the main labs are doing their best to create good constitutions and have ethical models, that you could have unscrupulous actors all over the world just like taking those models and retuning them for more nefarious purposes?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Guanaco, which is the model that I was referring to. Of course, I can give you like the whole transcript and for it to absorb and tune. But of course, you can also instruct it to imitate a scammer or things like that. But I think it's pretty good now that we have a wide understanding of how language models work and don't work, so that when people have already exposed ourselves to ChatGPT and other technologies, now I think is probably the time for us to also collectively look at the harms and misuses with the like on par with ChatGPT4 democratized models. But I do agree with you. If it gets even more advanced than that, then the whole equation changes. It will be like not just like a small fusion reactor, but a small fission reactor in everybody's living room, and that will change the dynamic tremendously. Yeah.
So what you are saying is that, beyond a certain threshold, the progress of artificial intelligence systems will require a major reevaluation. With that in mind, I have a question for you. How can we democratize social media in the same way that we are attempting to democratize artificial intelligence?
The fact that we now live in a world in which we have these devices that are connected, where every single one of us can transmit information back and forth, is incredible. And so if you imagine that we were developing systems on top of that basic internet infrastructure that were refined to be in service of not maximizing us clicking, not maximizing us staring, but maximizing for our values. And we could take each one of those values and consider what is the potential. So a value like connection or community. While social media gives you this kind of fake version of that, where you quasi feel like you're hanging out with your friends because you're seeing them doing fun things, real community comes from being together in person, from a depth of connection. And there's ways in which social media could be really helping people to come together in person. To the extent that we value knowledge and learning, social media, rather than amplifying the most radical, outrageous, clickbaity voices, could be helping us to make sense together and learn together and amplify the things that are most important for us to learn. To the extent that we value a fair and wise society, social media could be helping us develop empathy for each other's perspectives. There's all these ways in which we could be really introspecting and doing the philosophical exercise and the democratic participatory exercise of what are the things we care about. And then that becomes the design exercise of how do we make these systems ever more continuously improved to refine them to be in service of our deepest values. Ultimately, of course, that is a different incentive than what the companies currently have, which is to the things that will cause people to be more engaged are the things that maximize profit. And so I think I'll just end by saying, like, because that profit maximization incentive is so the water we swim in, we are the fish in the water that is capitalism. It's hard to even imagine what a different world could look like. And yet, I love this quote from Ursula Le Guin, we live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings. And that's not going to change overnight, but to the extent that we can collectively keep in our imaginations and keep as our goal the dismantling of these existing power structures that serve a small number of people at the expense of the many, we are able to move more and more in a direction where we can, if we can change the incentive structure, that will lead more naturally to people developing these technologies in alignment with social good. But even prior to that, we can, as individual designers and creators, start to be more mindful about what are the decisions we're making and be willing to make less money in exchange for aligning with the things we actually care about in our hearts and that we want for our society and for our children.
Yeah, indeed. I think on the individual level, what we have described in our relations to social media and technology can be referred to as just mindfulness, whether it's the push notifications, the use of stylus, and so on. That is mindfulness on an individual basis. But what I think social media has the potential to become is for a group, a community, to be also mindful, to reflect on the common values, the shared values, to facilitate both the catharsis of identifying the most polarizing sentiments in the community, surfacing it, but also surfacing the bridging narratives that bring those polars back into something that people also deeply care. It was just that there was no room to express those deeply care. So I think the platforms to foster mutual care and also to promote this community-scoped mindfulness is well within reach in the current generation of technologies. And we do see many social entrepreneurs starting building toward that vision. And once we do have that, then it's not hard to imagine it being scaled up, like Wikipedia did scale up toward different cultures, different languages, and so on, so as to build bridges across culturally, ethnically different groups. But first, I think community level, where people do meet face-to-face, and technology is just one way to enable people to make the most use of each other's mindful states when we do meet face-to-face. That is the right level of energy that I would like to see more social entrepreneurship and innovations putting their attention to.
I see. We need to turn technology back into a means of increasing our mindfulness and connections rather than seeing it as an escape from the real world. To conclude this interview, do you have any questions for each other?
Audrey, you've had so much success bringing new forms of democratic participatory tools into Taiwan. I think there's people like myself all over the world who are so inspired by your work. Do you have a vision for how you'd like to see that work become more popular and expanded? Are you taking any steps in that direction, or are you focused on just make Taiwan systems as good as they can be and allow other people to be inspired by that and adopt what they see fit?
Yeah, there's some of that, which is partly what this Innovative Minds podcast is about, is to see whether the Taiwan model that we have cooked up here is also broadly applicable to other jurisdictions, and also learning from digital leaders from other jurisdictions to make sure that we also incorporate the latest and the greatest in plurality and in many other eco-commoning-based thinking. So continued exchange of models, I think, is really the thing that I'm focusing on. But in my individual capacity, just as you, I'm advising and even joining as a team of the projects like Collective Intelligence Project. And that goal is not limited to Taiwan as a jurisdiction, but rather to really take this model and talk to I would include actually OpenAI in the sort of with profit for purpose companies, because they're technically a nonprofit governing a company, and see if the governance structures that we have prototyped in the municipality and the national government level also works to a startup like OpenAI or to a established enterprise and so on. So that, in a sense, is what we did around the turn of century when the term open source was coined. It was a marketing campaign for the free software people to convince the largest for-profit companies to turn into essentially a commoning with profits company like Mozilla did at the time. So I think I spent maybe 20% also of my time to like pet projects like these to try to radically transform existing players in the private sector so that they also see the value of democratic input.
Audrey, do you have any questions for Justin?
Yeah, so when you say that you, as part of one project, fund and discover and coordinate newer models of eco-commoning and of social entrepreneurship and community organizing, are there particular combinations of ideas or projects that you find the most interesting to the people that has the highest basic reproduction number? That is to say, ideas that kind of spread themselves that you've been discovering in the past few years?
Yeah, I mentioned the citizen council model, or citizen assembly, sortition, as it's technically called, in which you get a representative sample of the population together to deliberate. I think deliberation is such a critical. Yeah, I'm inspired by a story I've heard about the constitution editing process in Ireland, in which there's controversy about gay marriage, and if you had taken a popular vote of people in Ireland, the conclusion would have been that gay marriage would be illegal and unconstitutional. But there was a process of sortition of a group of people in Ireland coming together and discussing, and some of the people in that group were themselves gay. And in the course of deliberating, and in the course of not just intellectually deliberating, but getting to know each other as people, there was a sharing. In the course of getting to know each other as people, people's minds changed in that group. And by the end of the process, they decided that gay marriage would become legal in Ireland. That's an incredibly inspiring example of how people, not just voting and sort of yelling at each other on social media, but actually getting together in person, hearing each other's stories, hearing each other's perspectives, can create incredible outcomes. Similarly, one project has sponsored is called Of by Four, where they did an experiment of bringing together a sample of people to discuss COVID. And it was an incredibly controversial topic. They did this, right in the middle of the pandemic. And when they started, people were wildly divergent in their perspectives. But by the time they had gone through this multi-month facilitated process, there was an incredible amount of convergence and understanding. I think that is a process that can be at the heart of new democratic models, that then can be assisted by much more modern technology like artificial intelligence. AI presents this opportunity where you could build a system that literally could talk to every single citizen in a country or every single person in the world and allow them in their native language, in the way that they think, to express their desires, their values, their needs, their wishes for the world, and to integrate all of that into a plan that accommodated as many people's desires as possible. The potential there for using AI to do that kind of participatory governance and even like economic planning and resource distribution is incredibly exciting.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like level 2 assisted facilitation and deliberation. It's not like level 5 autonomous in silico deliberation, right? So I think this kind of level 2 AI in the loop assistive uses of the language models and so on for deliberative workshops and such communities is, I think, one of the most interesting like overlapping of the concerns that we have just been mentioning in this episode, and I'd like to discuss more in the future. How do we facilitate more in Taiwan and beyond such deliberative inputs into the entire system?
Through this conversation, it has become clear to me that establishing deliberative processes can facilitate agreement among diverse members of society. This approach will be crucial in reducing polarization in public debates. Again, I want to thank Justin and Audrey for joining us today. And if you liked today's episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and let us know what you think. See you next time on Innovative Minds.
Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Real pleasure. I'm Justin Rosenstein. See you on TaiwanPlus.
Hello, I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister. See you on TaiwanPlus.